Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Tom Banchoff. I serve as Vice President for Global Engagement here at Georgetown and as Director of our Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs, which is one of the co-sponsors for this afternoon's event. And on behalf of President DeGioia and our entire university community, I'm really delighted to welcome you all to a dialogue with Cardinal Michael Czerny of the Society of Jesus to mark the 10th anniversary of the election of Pope Francis and the publication of the Cardinal's very important new book, Siblings All, Sign of the Times, The Social Teaching of Pope Francis. Your Eminence, we're very honored that you can be with us this afternoon. And at the outset, I also want to acknowledge my colleague John Carr, founder of our initiative on Catholic social thought and public life, who are the main sponsors and organizers of our gathering this afternoon. I'd also note that Kim Daniels, the director of the initiative, is traveling abroad and regrets that she cannot be with us. Now, before I turn things over to John, who will be moderating our dialogue here on stage, just a couple of reflections, if you'll allow me. As we all know, today marks exactly a decade since Pope Francis took office. Like many of you here, I suspect, I was astounded and moved by Francis's first words and gestures just 10 years ago. His humility, his generosity, his depth of vision, and most of all, for me, his powerful living out of the gospel, his opening up of the church to the world in word, but especially in deed. A new beginning captured in the title of his remarkable apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, published just 8 months into his papacy. Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel. And through the twists and turns of the last decade, in the face of so many challenges, ongoing challenges, that remarkable inspirational joy has persisted to this very day. And coincidentally, or perhaps providentially, the start of Francis's papacy, as some of you know, took place alongside the creation of our Initiative for Catholic Social Thought and Public Life here at Georgetown. The initiative, which is celebrating its first decade with a series of excellent dialogues like this one, has emerged, I think we can say, as a leading university-based platform for dialogue and exploration of Catholic social thought as it relates to contemporary national and global challenges. Under the leadership of John and Kim, the initiative has both built on and enriched Georgetown's almost 2.5-century history as the oldest Catholic university in the United States and a Jesuit institution committed to academic excellence and to the common good. As the initiative looks to the next 10 years and beyond, as we reflect on the first decade of Francis's papacy together and on the challenges that lie ahead, as we explore the significance of Catholic social thought at this national and global moment of division, crisis, and war, we are extremely fortunate to have Cardinal Michael Czerny with us today in conversation. Cardinal Czerny serves as prefect of the Dicastery for Promoting Integral Human Development, a position he has held since 2022. Over the previous 5 years, he served as Undersecretary of the Dicastery's Migrants and Refugees section, reporting directly to Pope Francis, who named him Cardinal in 2019. Over the course of a long and distinguished career, Cardinal Czerny has been centrally involved in work at the intersection of Catholic social teaching and world affairs within the Society of Jesus and in the Pontifical Council for Justice and Peace, a predecessor of the dicastery he now leads. Cardinal Czerny is also one of the Church's most incisive and original thinkers and, as I mentioned, co-author of a new book along with Christian Baroni, Siblings All, Signs of the Times, with a foreword by Pope Francis, a book that grapples with the very important encyclical Fratelli Tutti, now 2.5 years old, and its significance for the Church and the world. So thanks again, Cardinal Czerny, for joining us. I'm now going to turn things over to John to begin the conversation on stage and then introduce the other participants in our dialogue. So thank you again for being here, and please join me in welcoming John and Cardinal Czerny.
Thank you, Tom, for those gracious words and for your personal support and leadership and of your colleagues in global engagement in the Berkeley Center during our first 10 years as an initiative. I think it's really important to remember how surprised we were when Pope Francis came out on that balcony. A Jesuit pope from Argentina, getting ready to retire, not a Vatican insider. The Irish and the British bookmakers had Cardinal Bergoglio as a 25-1 long shot. If we had made one bet, we could have paid for the first 10 years of this initiative if we only had. Anna Gordon and Kim Daniels of our team were there. As Tom mentioned, Kim cannot be with us. She's practicing a little Fratelli Tutti. She is in El Salvador on an Ignatian journey. My memories of those first days, there's so many. What he wore, where he stayed. Apparently it's a sin. You can tell me if this is right, to say what goes on in the conclave. And so what did Pope Francis do? But he called a press conference to share what went on in the conclave. And he was asked, why did he choose the name Francis? And he said, as it was getting dangerous, meaning the 2/3 was about to happen, Cardinal Hummes of Brazil leaned over, hugged him, gave him a kiss, he said, and said, don't forget about the poor. It's the first thing we learned about Pope Francis after he said, pray for me, on that balcony. We saw him wash the feet of inmates on Holy Thursday. His first visit was to Lampedusa. So we look back and we look ahead. Less than 2 weeks ago, we explored the impact of Pope Francis in the United States. We had a wonderful dialogue with Cardinal Gregory, our pastor, the Helen Alvarez, distinguished pro-life leader, E.J. Dion, a Georgetown professor. Some of you may know him as a Washington columnist. We think he's a Georgetown professor. And Pope Francis' favorite nun, at least in the United States, Sister Norma. And tonight we look more broadly at Pope Francis' leadership around the world, his global leadership. And the images are powerful. Remember him alone in St. Peter's Square at the beginning of COVID. Think about the encyclicals explained in Cardinal Czerny's book. So there's no one better on the actual anniversary of the election of Pope Francis to help us understand the global leadership of our Holy Father than Cardinal Michael Czerny. Tom talked about some of the formal things that Cardinal Czerny has done. A cardinal, leader of the dicastery before that, reporting directly to the Pope on migrants and refugees. But there are two things that I think many do not know. And I hope I get this right, but my understanding, you were born in Czechoslovakia, your mother's family was Jewish, they became Catholics. When the Nazis occupied Czechoslovakia, your maternal grandparents and two of your mother's brothers were interned in Terezin, where your grandfather was murdered. The others were moved to Auschwitz. And your great uncles died in labor camps. The cardinal's mother, because she was Jewish, was forced into farm labor and imprisoned for 20 months. His father was forced to farm labor for refusing to divorce his mother. And then this young family moved to Canada by ship, bringing 2-year-old Michael and his brother. Another thing that you may not know, many of us have terrible memories of the murder of the Jesuits at the University in El Salvador. Many of us worked to right that wrong. Cardinal Czerny was in Canada at the time, and he picked up his life, moved to El Salvador, and took the place of one of the murdered Jesuits as the head of the university's Institute for Human Rights. So here is a leader in our church who left your birthplace and left Canada to now serve the church in carrying out the social teaching, especially the church's global mission. So let me ask a few questions. Early in the book, you say that to understand Pope Francis, it is not enough to refer to his documents and speeches, but it is necessary to look at his actions. After 10 years, what are the words, what are the actions that best define Pope Francis' global leadership?
I think the actions which communicate mercy, misericordia, are the ones that I think he would want to have mentioned. I think if he succeeds in communicating the misericordia of God in the many different situations where it's so badly needed. And I say that because it's not only setting wrongs right, but it's liberating people to respond. We can't respond if we're crippled by our sins. And it's only if we embrace the misericordia of God that we can be free to respond to the needs of our siblings. I think that's why I would make that choice.
What are the actions that you think symbolize that in terms of Pope Francis in these last 10 years?
Well, one of them would be the opening of the Jubilee door in Africa. And others, you already mentioned the trip to Lampedusa. And I actually met the parish priest in Lampedusa, and he said that they had about 2 days warning that the Pope was coming. So it's probably the fastest organized papal visit in all of history.
There are several heart attacks at the Vatican, weren't there?
I don't know.
No. Your pectoral cross tell us about that.
Well, so this comes from a Lampedusa boat that would have originally been a fishing boat in North Africa. And when these boats arrive, or more or less don't arrive, the wood is now a sign of solidarity with the migrant fleeing people. And so for me, it's a contemporary crucifix. It depicts both how Jesus is shedding his blood, how he's nailed to the cross, but also how he's rising from the dead.
That first visit to Lampedusa in some ways set the tone. Both you and Pope Francis have put the dignity and rights of migrants and refugees at the center of your work and his leadership.
But if I could say that I think that he has chosen these migrants and refugees because of their great need, because of their suffering, but also because they so effectively symbolize or sum up all those who are marginalized. And it would be a great mistake to say, well, I'm following Pope Francis, so I'm not going to get involved in local poverty questions or racism or women's rights, because those are secondary. I'm only going to work on migrants. That would be to misunderstand completely. Migrants and refugees help us to understand the full range of response that is expected. And many of you probably already know the 4 verbs that Pope Francis articulated. And what I find striking is that they apply to every marginalized group you can think of: to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. Just think of any group that you're at all connected with, at all sympathetic with, or even that you belong to, and say, well, is not that what we're wanting and needing? To be welcomed, protected, promoted, and integrated.
It's powerful. In this country, there's no controversy about immigrants or refugees.
What we call a no-brainer.
Yeah. How do we see, as you see, as Pope Francis see, these people through these lives, these faces, as the face of Christ, as the lives of the least of these, instead of a political issue?
Well, it's. I think the difference is if we can allow them to be human, if we can allow them to speak and to touch us, as opposed to talking about them as a problem, as a threat, as a menace to our civilization. I don't know of anyone who has met migrants and refugees who've come recently who has said, well, I met them and now I know they're terrible. No, it never happens. And often it takes just one meeting for someone to realize that the inhumanity lens that they were using was pure ideology and pure confusion.
Later in the program, we're going to talk a little about that. One of the things that marks Pope Francis' leadership is Laudato Si, where he placed care for creation at the center of a Christian ethic and care for the vulnerable at the center of an environmental ethic. And in so doing, I think challenged all of us. How does Laudato Si in fact challenge us, particularly leaders like those in this room? We have 1,500 people online. One of the great things about doing online dialogues is not only you reach more people, but you have to start on time. So be grateful. But how do we see that challenge as something that we can act on?
Well, one of the ways I think is that Pope Francis avoided writing a green encyclical. So he, maybe we could say that he rescued environmental concerns from a ghetto in which it had developed, which allowed again for us-them attitudes, those of us who are green versus all the rest, or those of us who prefer a developed way of life versus those who want to destroy it. And instead of that, he placed and he gave it this very, very human name, Care for Our Common Home. And in one fell swoop, I think he enormously enriched our mission, our ministry, and our spirituality. And at the same time, he really opened an area of dialogue that had been among the deaf until Laudato Si. I don't think I've ever heard repeated the foolish things that used to be said before Laudato Si about the incompatibility of the environment with human life and things like that. That's just gone now, and I think we realize that it's a to quote another great Catholic leader, it's a seamless garment, and that we have to work on every aspect of it together.
When he says we must hear the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor, it strikes our heart, but it also challenges our head. How do we do both?
Well, I think one of the big challenges is to recognize that our goodness or our generosity in helping, in responding to the cry of the poor is actually, and correctly, also an act of self-preservation. That if we don't respond, that we're not going to reestablish a common home for ourselves. We're going to tear apart what we've received from God and say, sorry, we didn't really want this human life on this earth. We prefer destruction.
You work in the Vatican, you're Canadian, you came from Czechoslovakia, you know our country. You went to Gonzaga, which is in the basketball tournament, which is a sore spot for some of us.
They told me that it's the real GU.
We used to be friends. On behalf of President DeGioia. No. We had a session here of Catholic leaders. A couple of our friends were here for it. And it was mostly talking amongst ourselves, how we advance Pope Francis' mission and message. How do we bring Catholic social teaching into public life? And we had two different pollsters from differing perspectives, and they shared what was going on and lots of very interesting stuff. And they both said the most interesting thing, the most unifying thing in the Catholic community is the love of Pope Francis. More than 80% of Catholics approve. That's more than Trump and Biden are all put together. Yet we have a sense that Pope Francis is, quote, divisive or controversial. You are in some ways knowledgeable about us, but also an outsider. What's your analysis of the resistance to Pope Francis, which is apparently narrow, but is powerful? Where do you think it comes from? How can it be reconciled? How can we build up greater unity?
Maybe one way of saying it would be that if you think, if you're convinced that your parish is the only reality of the church, and that everything outside of that is either irrelevant or a threat, then I think a Holy Father who is encouraging our church to go to the peripheries, which by definition are outside the parish, is disconcerting. And maybe the insecurities that people feel for a number of reasons, which we could go into if we had several hours, these insecurities coincide with maybe the perplexity or the perplexity of. But I thought that being a Catholic meant hanging on to and staying inside the parish, and I don't understand why all these other constituencies are essential to my being a Catholic, and so it's like being threatened by an invasion of foreign invaders, something like that. I think it's just a very sad and false image of that fidelity to the church means keeping the walls as high as possible and not opening the door.
Mm-hmm. I think of my little parish. We're everywhere. We're Latino, we're African American, a few old Anglos left, and the one thing we agree on is we love Pope Francis. And it may be that the invaders are the outsiders who want to lay an ideology or something upon us. I want to ask a two-part question, and then we'll invite our friends up to continue the conversation. First of all, why did you, is it Father Baroni or Father Barone that you wrote the book
Baroni,
with?
yeah.
Why did you write the book? And it's a great book. I've read it, so you don't have to yet, but you will have a chance to buy it. Why did you write it? What do you hope to accomplish? And then at the very end, the appendices, there are two appendices.
Well, let me answer the first question first.
Okay, sure.
And then we'll get to the appendices. Father Christian and I got to know each other, and one of the topics we shared on was this paradox that, on the one hand, you cannot understand the teaching and the mission and the ministry of Pope Francis apart from Vatican II. And on the other hand, he doesn't explain that connection. He scarcely ever mentions the council. And so, unless you yourself already know the council very well and have sort of figured out the connection, it escapes you. And it seemed to us that that connection was very important for our sense of church, very important for our appreciation of the council, which is a defining event of our time, and not to appreciate and accept that is to separate yourself from the church. So We thought that was important. And when I asked him if he thought that was important, he agreed. So we set off to write the book. What we didn't know and what he didn't consult us about was Fratelli Tutti. That was done behind our backs. And so, 2/3 of the way through the book, we had to recalibrate because we couldn't write the book about Vatican II without, in a sense, presenting also what is the compendium of the Holy Father's teaching. And so now we have the book we should have in 2 parts.
That's terrific. I'm going to invite our colleagues to join us and continue the conversation. And while they're coming up, I want to acknowledge something, that you and I have been friends and collaborators for a long time.
1,000 years.
And if I had known you were going to be a cardinal, and if you were going to lead the dicastery, and you were going to be a close advisor to the Holy Father, I would have been nicer to you through all these years. I've always admired you, but the Holy Father saw you for the leader that you are for all of us now. So we're very grateful for your service to the Holy Father and your service to the whole church and the way you lift up the heart of our church. So thank you very much.
And the Holy Father told me that from now on, John Carr was going to be nicer to me.
Yeah. He didn't check with me.
No, it was.
All right. We are so glad to continue the conversation with 3 of our colleagues. And they have different backgrounds, but they share a love for Pope Francis. One great thing about Catholics, you can be always sure that the last seats are always in the front row. So for those of you that are standing in the back, there are a few seats up here if you're willing to come forward. So I'm going to introduce each of them and then ask a question in turn. And I want to start with you, Tony. Tony Annett is an economist with a doctorate from Columbia. He served many years at the International Monetary Fund. We'll ask you about these banks and whether we should put our cash under our mattress later. But the reason you're here is you wrote a remarkable book called Cathonomics that one reviewer said should be required reading in every Catholic business school. You have a gift for sharing Catholic social teaching on economics and global responsibility in faithful, challenging, and accessible ways. So, Tony, the subtitle of your book is How Catholic Tradition Can Create a More Just Economy. Please give us the 3-minute answer to that question.
Okay, putting the clock on. Thank you, John. Thank you and Kim for inviting me here. And thanks to Cardinal Czerny for endorsing my book. Very much appreciated. Okay, the 3-minute version of Cathonomics. That's hard, so I think I'll just focus on 1 or 2 brief issues about how Catholic social teaching would inform how we talk and think about the global economy today. So I think one place we have to start, and Pope Francis talks about this a lot, is with the universal destination of goods. The idea that the goods of the earth are destined for all people without exclusion, where nobody can be excluded, especially not the poor. Now that has very profound implications for our economy today. Pope John Paul II says it means that private property always comes with a social mortgage. Or Pope Francis says that private property rights are legitimate, but they're only secondary natural rights. He says that in Fratelli Tutti. He doesn't invent that. He gets that from the Church Fathers. He gets that from Thomas Aquinas, who talked about the distinction between private ownership of property and common use of property. So it's very clear, and that has, as I said, that has very profound implications. What it means is, it means, in a sense, the poor have rights against the rich. That's not just about personal charity. It's not just about what you personally owe out of your own surplus, even though that is part of it. It also refers to the public authorities. Again, I'll quote Pope Paul VI, who says very clearly, when private ownership and common use are out of whack, it's the role of the public authorities to bring them back in alignment. So that has very clear implications for for how we structure our economy today. Very radical implications, I would argue. The second point reads, so 60 years ago this year, Pope John XXIII wrote Pacem in Terris, a remarkable encyclical. Now, he talked a lot about peace in that encyclical, but he also talked about something very interesting. He talked about human rights, which was a bit of a departure for Catholic social teaching. And when I read this, what struck me was when he lists what the human rights are, the first right is the right to life, but the second rights after that are economic rights. They're not political rights, they're not civil rights, they're economic rights. They're rights to such goods as food, shelter, clothing, education, healthcare, just wages, the right to form unions and bargain collectively. All of these things are crucial. These are the first rights in Catholic social teaching. But our free market economy today recognizes only property rights, and again, in a fairly absolute sense, not the conditional sense of Catholic social teaching, and it doesn't really recognize economic rights at all. So I'll wind up my 3 minutes by just basically saying that what all this implies is that everybody in the economy has to be oriented towards the common good. Pope Francis, in a recent interview, put this brilliantly, I thought. He said that you need a three-legged stool between the state, capital, and work. So the state, business, and workers. And if you knock out any one leg of that stool, the whole stool falls over, and you need all three to work properly. And I try to talk about that in Cathonomics, how you would practically design this kind of three-legged stool to create a more just global economy.
Thank you, Tony. That was terrific. You're obviously an advocate for Pope Francis' global leadership, especially on economics. Not everyone is. Why do you think the Pope Francis message is what the world needs to hear at this point? And why do you think some people, particularly people with power, resist it?
Well, I think it's extremely important because of I've been studying economics for decades. And, you know, the leading economic problems in the world today, we are an extremely wealthy world. We have $100 trillion of a global economy, and yet we have 700 million people living in extreme poverty. We have massive inequality. We have the environmental challenge of pollution, climate change, and biodiversity loss. We just have so much exclusion and so much globalization of indifference. And this is why Pope Francis, even though I would argue in my book that he's in direct continuity with his predecessors, he nonetheless brings a kind of a freshness and a starkness to his emphasis on Catholic social teaching, as Cardinal Czerny describes so well in his book. Why the opposition? Oh, how long do we have? That's a tricky question. I think a lot of it is simply wealthy people don't like listening to some of these messages. It makes them uncomfortable sometimes. I also think on the intellectual side of things, there has been, especially in the US, there has been a strand of Catholic thinking which tries to align Catholic social teaching much more with free market economics. Certainly, thinkers and theologians like Michael Novak have attempted to do that. I would argue that that's not a valid interpretation of Catholic social teaching, and that's why we need Pope Francis.
You talked about how Pope Francis makes us feel uncomfortable. When he said that, the Cardinal said, don't forget about the poor, he said, I want a poor church for the poor. That makes me uncomfortable. That's not my church. Tony talked about the teaching. I want to talk with you, Joan, a little bit about the action. You and I have been colleagues for many years at the Bishops' Conference. Then you went to Catholic Relief Service, vice president, and now you're the director of Jesuit Refugee Services. You've always helped U.S. Catholics try and find ways to act on their faith, especially the global dimensions of our faith, which is very challenging. So my question is, how has that work over decades changed because of Pope Francis' mission and message and leadership, especially affecting refugees and migrants, which are the core of your work and your colleagues' work?
Well, I think that one of the things that we have to acknowledge about Pope Francis and his teaching is that he has made it so clear no one can be paying attention to the Catholic Church globally and not understand that people on the margins are at the heart of who we are and what we believe, and how we respond to them is central to living our faith. And I don't know that that was what we were most known for before Francis, but I'm delighted that we are known for that, because it does change our ability to engage people in responding to the needs of people on the margins, especially migrants and refugees. I do want to just lift up a couple of things about how he has taught and how he has connected our concern for migrants and refugees and others on the margins. And I understand they're an example of all the people who are suffering that we need to pay attention to. But John, as you said, that's where I'm focusing my attention these days. So to look at his teaching, one of the really interesting things that he said is that it's not enough to understand that we have to both give people the right not to migrate and the right to migrate. We have to understand that if we can't guarantee people the right not to migrate, then we have to help people migrate. Then we have to support people as they're fleeing their homes, because they can't exercise that right not to migrate. Another key thing that he has said, and I'm so glad that Tony raised the universal destination of created goods, because if it was up to me, if I was in charge, every pastor would be required to make sure that everyone in his parish understood Catholic teaching about the universal destination of created goods, because it is such a profound message about how we live our lives and how we understand what we do with the gifts that God has given us. But as it relates to migrants and refugees, what he basically has said is, if everyone has a right to enjoy the goods of creation, then what are we called to when it comes to people who have lost everything, who've lost their home, who've been forced to flee their home? Of course, we have to circle back to support them. And so, again, it prioritizes those people on the margins in a way that our church just has not. Not that we haven't done anything, not that there haven't been really good people here, Bishop Seitz and others, who have been working really hard on these issues for a long time. But I think one can't look at Pope Francis and his teaching and not understand that we actually do have to act. And I just want to lift up one other dimension. I think I have 3 minutes too, but one other dimension, and that is in Laudato Si, when he talks about care for creation and all of the implications of our failure to care for creation. One of the implications he lifts up is that people are going to be displaced as our environment is destroyed and as climate is changing. And in fact, the World Bank recently suggested that by 2050, 216 million people will be displaced by climate change. So all of this teaching that he has lifted up for us and prioritized for us in a way that it has not been prioritized in the past, I think, really also helps us focus on the people who are very much on the margins. Climate change affects those with the least ability to adapt the most, and that's all kinds of people who are poor and suffering, but especially migrants and refugees. So I think his teaching has really allowed us to mobilize and lift this up in a way that we weren't able to before.
That's really helpful. Given that, and given that we're not where we want to be, not everyone knows the universal destination of goods or the priority for the poor, much less subsidiarity. Subsidiarity is not in the spell check for word, so we have some work to do. What are one or two lessons you've learned in doing this work?
Well, I think one thing is, and you've heard me say this before, John, that I really believe something that is very much reflected in Cardinal Czerny's book is critical, and that is to not act like somehow Pope Francis discovered the poor or discovered mercy or discovered migrants and refugees. We always have to acknowledge how his teaching is rooted in the tradition of the church. And so in your book, you lift up the Second Vatican Council, you lift up the teaching of John Paul II, that's the teaching of Benedict XVI. I think it's critical because if it's just something that Francis has discovered as something new and a priority that we didn't have before somehow, it's too easily dismissed. And there are too many people. You've asked why are people not as supportive of Francis? Or maybe we have a misperception about that, but it's certainly my perception. And I think it's partly that Catholics are more shaped by the culture in their political party than they are by the teaching of the church. And as long as that's the case, they will be free to dismiss something that is brand new. But they have to understand that Pope Francis is elaborating and prioritizing teaching that has been a part of our tradition for a very long time. So we have to root it. And then I think we have to answer people's question, what can I do? And what I do all the time is to answer, there are lots of things that all of us can do to respond to people on the margins. I loved in Fratelli Tutti, when he talks about the Good Samaritan story, one of my kind of light bulb moments, and probably everybody in this room is deeper and more thoughtful than I am, and you thought about this before. But for me is when he lifted up the innkeeper. And he kind of said, well, the innkeeper comes along on this mission. And we all have to come together like that. It's not just the star, the Samaritan, that we have to pay attention to and try to be like as much as we can, but we can also be like the innkeeper. And, I thought, yes, I can be like the innkeeper a lot. And we can all be like the innkeeper, doing things in our daily lives that help people on the margins. And it's working with Catholic Charities. It's working with Hope Border Institute is here, working in El Paso. We do a lot of work with them in our work in El Paso. We have a network, and we're looking for volunteers to support newcomers as they settle all over the country. So there are very practical things that we can all do that can contribute. We may feel like we're not changing the world, we're not being the Good Samaritan that is known globally, but we can all play a role. We can all do our part and at least be the innkeeper.
It just occurred to me, I may have called you Joan, but I might not have told people your last name. This is Joan Rosenauer, who is the executive director of the Jesuit Refugee Services in the United States. So we've talked about the teaching, we've talked about some of the action. Now we're going to talk a little bit about personal and professional. Zain Halibava, is that close? Very good. I'm so proud of myself. You bring multiple perspectives to this discussion of Pope Francis' global leadership. First of all, you're part of the Georgetown family. You're a student here at the School of Foreign Services in the Center for Eurasia, Russian, and East European Studies, with a particular focus on migration. But you didn't come to this as an academic. You told me you had to leave, your family had to leave your home country of Kyrgyzstan because of interethnic violence. And you and your husband and your daughter fled to Russia, which was a very difficult place because of racism and xenophobia. And you have taken that experience and your passion for human rights and migrant issues and have sought the knowledge and the opportunity to change things. So you went to the American University of Central Asia. You went to Notre Dame. You might have heard of that place. You got a master's in peace studies. And you served at Catholic Relief Studies, providing technical support for peacemaking. As we're talking about a wonderful book and Pope Francis and Cardinal Czerny's leadership, then we talk about the principles. Then we talk about what the church is doing in some ways. Tell us what it means to a family.
Okay. Thank you very much for this invitation. And I hope I will not get very emotional about this. And well, first of all, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Cardinal Czerny for to making refugee and migrants' voices heard in Vatican. And also to everyone in this panelists and in participants for every step, every day, what you do to make refugee or migrants' life better. So I wanted to start with very simple words. That is, Assalamu alaikum. That's Muslim greeting that we wish peace upon you. That's a very simple but deep meaning. Peace is what everyone who is fleeing right now, who fled or plan to flee their home, is looking for. A peace, a place, a shelter, a safety, a place where they can have an opportunity to flourish and thrive. So, as you said, in 2010, we left my country, Kyrgyzstan, and we went to Russia. So I can talk a lot about that and all of these challenges that we faced, but let me tell you a very short story, because I wrote a completely different speech before I came here, but then I decided to share it in a story. So imagine we ended up in far east of Russia, that's the town Khabarovsk. That is, and it was winter time, so imagine it was strong wind, 104 degrees Celsius, and I'm working on a construction site with my husband, and well, I'm as a cook and he's as a driver, well, very gendered roles. And I heard voices, like 10 to 15 men who were also Central Asians from Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. They work there as a construction workers. So they're running and shouting my name on the top of their lungs. I was so scared. I was like, oh my gosh, my food was so bad that they decided to come up and confront me. And that would be a disgrace for my mom and my mother-in-law to learn that, oh my gosh, she cannot cook. So they running, and I was like, I was in the kitchen, and imagine it's 104 degrees, so I had to put on this heavy lambskin coat, my babushka style scarf, my long felt boots, and went outside. It was like, what's happening? Of course I was scared, but then I listened. They used a very respectful form of my name, and I was like, oh, okay, that means I didn't screw up the food. So they came and said, you know Russian, right? I said, yes, I know. You have education, right? I said, yes, I do. Okay, help us. I was like, with what? I mean, I cannot help myself. I'm also have the same similar documents as all of you. And he said, no, there is so apparently there were policemen every day. There would be a policeman who would come to construction site and would ask for bribes every day. So, and people who did not speak Russian, who didn't know the laws, they were so terrified and they couldn't fight back. So they couldn't get hold of my husband, so they decided to come for me. I was like, okay. So next day, I read all of the laws, and so I was in full armor. Imagine 5 to 6 very tall Slavic Russian policemen standing, and me, a short Central Asian woman, and with 20 to 50 Central Asian men standing behind me. And I was like the same lambskin coat, the felt boots, babushka style scarf on my head, and fighting back, standing up and saying, you have no right to persecute those men. And if you have any problems with their documents, you have to do it in orderly manner. So that was my armor. My education, my knowledge, and the ability to read laws, that was my armor. And since then, I decided that I want to continue doing that. In Islam, we say that if you help one person, it means you're helping the world. So I thought that if I can help even one person to make their life better, that would make me a better person. And also it can come around, and someday one person will help me and my family. So I must say that I was blessed. I was blessed by dozens and hundreds of people who were on my way and who did help me to end up here, where I am right now, next to Cardinal Czerny, talking to you and telling my story. So, of course, I must say that when I came here in 2019, being girl from post-Soviet Muslim country, Kyrgyzstan. Of course, I knew nothing about Catholic social teaching before 2019, before I ended up at University at Notre Dame. And then I studied a lot, and Pope Francis books were very in the core of our curriculum. And of course, when I came here, I continued, and I worked at Catholic Relief Services. And I must say that there is so much things that Pope Francis already indicated what we as a humanity can do. And first of all, I would like to appreciate that he puts a humanity. He puts a person behind those numbers. So now you can hear that there are around 90 million people who are displaced. But I am one of them. My family of 3, my husband and my daughter, who is now already 15, almost 15, she is one of those numbers. Yes, we do have challenges. Sometimes I cannot help even myself, even having my 2 master's degrees from prominent universities. Yes, I cannot help it, but I can help someone else. For example, right now I am working with those who are fleeing the unlawful draft to Russian army to fight the unjust war in Ukraine. I'm helping them. Thank you. And if you hear those stories, their stories are so terrifying. But at the same time, I would want to finish it with a quote from Pope Francis. I want every one of you, despite your religion, despite your social background, despite your education, to practice the gods. Sorry, I'm getting very overexcited and emotional. So I just want to read. Loving our neighbor means feeling compassion for the sufferings of our brothers and sisters, drawing close to them, touching their stories and sharing their stories, and those manifesting concretely God's tender love for them. So I was fortunate. There were so many people who were on my way, who wanted to listen to my story. But I want this to be more, to help one person and to help the world. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. It's a powerful story from a powerful woman. And you know more Catholic social teaching than most Catholics. Zane mentioned Ukraine. Cardinal, you have been to Ukraine on behalf of the Holy Father a couple times. I see Archbishop Boris here. What was your experience? What did you see? And what is the Holy Father trying to accomplish in terms of dealing with this horrific war and the violation of peace?
I only visited the border area, so I didn't experience the war itself. But it was very striking how people on both sides of the border, in Ukraine, in Hungary, and Slovakia, how people responded to the needs of those who were fleeing. That was, you could say that they were responding not only to the immediate needs, but they were also responding to the war and defeating it even as it was being waged. I think that what Pope Francis is doing is making every effort to help a peace to become possible. And in doing that, he is trying, and I think this is a great lesson for us, he's treating everyone involved with humanity. The fact that some are completely wrong or extremely violent, it doesn't mean that they've lost their humanity. And he doesn't lose sight of their humanity.
Mm-hmm. Well, now we're going to open it up, and let me take the privilege of the chair. There are remarkable leaders in this room and online, but there are 2 pastors here who are at the heart of what we've been talking about. I think of Archbishop Boris Guziak, who spent his life in service of the church in Ukraine and now in the United States. And I think of Bishop Seitz, who is very much on the front line with the humanitarian crisis on the border. Archbishop Seitz, do you just want to say a word about the pastoral dimensions of what you've heard today about Pope Francis' global leadership?
Yes. With pleasure. Thank you very much. So good to be with all of you. I didn't even realize you were all back here. But so much that could be said, right? And I'll just try to make give you a few brief thoughts. The whole immigration issue, if you look at it from a policy point of view, it's extremely complex. It is, no offense, Archbishop, it's Byzantine. It's much more complicated than your income tax to try and figure out all of the rules and policies and laws that apply to immigration. But on the side of the church, on the side of being a disciple of Jesus Christ, I think our Holy Father has reminded us that it's really quite simple. It's quite simple. Serve those who are suffering. Care for those who are in your midst, especially, who are in need. Recognize Lazarus at your door. Care for the Samaritan who has been waylaid along the road. Give something to that person that is different than you, the poor widow who just asks for nothing more than the scraps at the table. That is what our Holy Father is inviting us to come back to. And I very much would like to affirm that it's not new in the teaching of the church, but our Holy Father has just helped us to recognize that evangelical nature of service of the poor. And in our world today, in which they estimate that 100,000 people, 100 million people in our world are presently displaced. And that number is growing more than ever in the history of humanity. We have not the burden, but the opportunity to be disciples of Jesus Christ and to live it.
Bishop, thank you. That was powerful. A homily in the middle of a wonderful homily in the middle of our conversation. You talked about responding to the suffering. There literally has to be no place on earth with greater suffering than Ukraine. And the Cardinal spoke about what he saw. Archbishop Guziak, you have spent your life in Ukraine and now in the United States as a leader. Can you just say a very brief word about how what we've talked about here, these principles, this action, the global leadership of the church, touches the horrors of the war in Ukraine?
I want to thank Georgetown for the hospitality to all of us and for, in this past year, really, under your leadership, Tom, and other colleagues, giving a platform to the suffering in Ukraine. What really has touched the world and Christians, but even those who are not baptized in the ministry and witness of Pope Francis? I think he has acted in a way that's very similar to Jesus. He's made Jesus come alive. He's been very concrete, very direct. And that underlines a fundamental principle of our faith, that God became man. It's very concrete. There's a place, there's a time, there's a body, there's a culture, there's a crisis, which answers the question of all times. And so in this situation, where 14 million people have been displaced. Probably never have there been so many people displaced so quickly. 2 months. The people killed, 150,000 homes destroyed. In this situation, Pope Francis has tried to speak concretely, to speak about the suffering of people. And he does it twice a week at almost every audience. He also has received people. Some of that receiving is visible, some of it is discreet. He's worked, for example, through Turkish authorities to liberate prisoners of war. Very important prisoners of war. Hundreds, probably into the thousands by now. Because the fate of prisoners of war is unimaginable. The torture, the rapes of women, the executions. Maybe you saw last week a little video of an execution of a POW emerged. So that concreteness, which is something that I think Jesus came to bring from the Father, in which we read about in the Gospels, and which inspires us and moves us, and which is the truth and the way and the life. I think that's the really strong side of Pope Francis's response to what is happening in Ukraine.
Powerful. Well, now there's an opportunity to ask questions, make a brief comment. I'll repeat my mantra. It's best if you put your question in the form of a question, but we won't enforce that absolutely. We've got about 10 minutes to do this, so we can see right there. Wait, hold on for a microphone.
Thank you. Thank you all for inspiring reports. I wanted to just note that Catholic social teaching didn't begin in the 1800s or early 1900s. It began with Jesus, and he treated the thief who was crucified beside him as a human being. So I'd like to put in a note that Catholic social teaching is a lot older than we think. And then I want to have a little advertisement for the head of Barbados, a woman of color who is designing a plan that makes it look like she studied Catholic social teaching. It includes respect for the environment as well as forgiving debts that are unpayable, and then reviving the World Bank so that it is a World Bank able to work with pandemics and the environment. And I don't have a question. I apologize.
Who else? How about right here? Marie.
Microphone. Thank you. Thank you, and thank you all very much. In the 2017 World Day of Peace message on nonviolence and in Fratelli Tutti and elsewhere, Pope Francis has repeatedly appealed to the world for an end to war, for an end to the arms trade, for an end to the displacement, the terrible displacement that war envisions. Cardinal Czerny, I wonder if you could just say a little bit about the paradigm shift that Pope Francis envisions toward a just peace and toward nonviolence, and that he so frequently alludes to. Could you say a little more about that, please?
Well, I think one of the most important ways in which he speaks about what you're asking is his insistence on dialogue. Dialogue is the is the answer to all of the questions that Laudato Si raises. And then if I could add a second very important element, better politics is the outcome of everything he says in Fratelli Tutti. And this combination of dialogue and better politics is the only realistic response to the challenges that we've talked about this evening and so often, because it has us recovering our capacity to deal with our problems. We have lost that. We generate problems that are way beyond our capacity to solve them. And the only way to recover our capacity is to learn to dialogue and to practice good politics. And that would be a summary answer, I think, of the great question you asked.
Well, that's very helpful because Washington is the epitome of dialogue and an example of the better power. Nothing has been more clear than the importance of Catholic social teaching than that answer. Over there.
Hello, thank you all for coming, especially to you. Cardinal Czerny, thank you so much. My name is Father Jordan Willard. I'm a parish priest for the See of Arlington, just across the river. I remember Pope Francis being elected when I was halfway through seminary. I went to the Pontifical College Josephinum in Columbus, and I was in my senior year of college seminary at the time. I never would have dreamt to see the kind of, especially within my own see in which I serve, the growth or the distasteful measure of animosity, I should say, towards Pope Francis. But it's been especially difficult for me, even during my just the 5 years I've been a priest. But I liked what Mr. Annette said, that we need to see that there is no discontinuity between Francis is not the antithesis of his predecessors, and I remember I've been trying to make that kind of a motif of some of my preaching, and I remember just one of the homilies I had given, I just correlated John the Baptist's exhortation to the bystanders around the Jordan River to one comment that Benedict had made in Deus Caritas Est, the redistribution of goods. And I not only got in trouble with the pastor, but I got I was scrutinized. I had to go over to the chancery and report for that. It's like, I guess my question is I mean, it's an uphill battle as it is to get people to listen to the See of Rome, especially Pope Francis, but what needs to be done especially to really hone in, really gather the shepherds into unity, to kind of adopt that, the sentiments that our Lord gave in the upper room. I pray that you all be one as the Father and I are one. Like, what can and must be done to unify just the shepherds themselves into the message on the Catholic Social Initiative, this integrated gospel. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, this ought to be good.
The short answer is the Synod. The short answer is the Synod. The Synod is our chance to learn how to be church for now and for the future. A Synod is, which the Church in the East can teach us a lot about, is it's learning to walk the walk that we need to walk, and that the word synod, together, walking together, means that you can't walk alone. And if we're at loggerheads, and even if we are critical and or even hostile, the solution is still the same. We've got to learn to walk together. And as naive as it sounds, I think that the only option we have is to listen to those who are unhappy, and then let the Holy Spirit take care of the rest.
To conclude here, I'd like to have Joan, who has spent many years trying to build up the unity of the church on these questions, to respond to Father. First of all, we ought to acknowledge that some borders are falling. The Diocese of Arlington made it across the river. And then to ask every one of the panelists for their most vivid memory or word or action that represent the global leadership of Pope Francis. But Joan, so a comment on Father's comment, and then one moment, one action, one word that epitomizes the global leadership. And then I'll go to Tony and then Zane, and we'll conclude with the Cardinal.
Well, I guess first I would say, Father, that I think we all have so much of a foundation to help build with people's understanding of the gospel and what questions it leads us to. And I think before we get to Catholic social teaching, which is a kind of a deeper elaboration of what the gospel tells us, we have to start with the gospel, not by telling people what the gospel means for us or what their position should be in light of gospel messages, but by inviting them to answer that question for themselves more directly. And I remember when I was at CRS, Catholic Relief Services, we did a market research and had people who were generally hostile, not like adamant, but kind of hostile toward refugees and migrants and things. And they were asked the question, so what does the scripture passages about welcoming the stranger mean for you? And what does it mean for you to love your neighbor as yourself as it relates to your position on this? And there were no answers given to them about, there's no suggestion that we had the right answer, but they were just asked, and people had like a deer in the headlights reaction. Wait, you mean we're supposed to wait, I hadn't thought about that. But I think we have to ask that question a lot more often, and maybe starting with scripture before we even get to some of the really profound. But I'm with you on, sometimes when I do presentations, I'll start with a bunch of papal quotes about migrants and refugees, and not one of them is from Francis. They're from Benedict and they're from John Paul II, et cetera, just to lift up this idea that people think that it's something new, and so they can react in ways and get angry.
One image, action, or word?
I guess I would have to say walk the walk. That, yeah, it's essential, not just to talk about the teaching, but and he does that so profoundly in so many ways.
Tony?
For me, the thing that will always stand out to me is this month, 3 years ago, during the worst part of COVID, when this dark and rainy Roman night, the Pope walked in St. Peter's Square on his own to give a profound meditation on what it's like to be alone and afraid. That was absolutely brilliant, and I will never forget that night.
Zane?
For me, it was when Pope Francis agreed and called that refugees and migrants can live coexisting peacefully with local communities, plus they can enrich and improve the life of the city. So that was very powerful for me.
Cardinal?
I think the dialogue and friendship with the Grand Imam is an extraordinary response to our troubled world and our doubtful future. And I think it's such a sign of hope that it stands out for me.
Every moderator wants to answer his own question. So for me, it was when Pope Francis came to the United States, stood at the podium in our capital and challenged us to look at the faces of immigrants and migrants. He didn't call for passage of H.R. 2323. He asked us to see the human beings. And even more important than what he said was what he did. He left the chamber. I was honored to be in the chamber. He went to the front of the Capitol. Some of you were out there. And then he didn't go to have this fancy lunch with, the most powerful people in the city and the world, but he went to Catholic Charities and had a meal with the hungry and homeless here in the nation's capital. And he told us what to do, but more importantly, showed us what to do. So I want to thank you for joining us, invite you to a reception afterwards, some of our best time as people getting to know each other. I want to preview some upcoming dialogues. This is, I think, our 155th dialogue. I could be wrong about that. This takes us over 265,000 people. Thanks to those of you online, thanks to those of you in the room. But we're going to do a dialogue in April on what happened to Matthew 25 in our church and in our nation. What has happened to the question of poverty? We're going to ask with young people, what is work now after COVID in this economy? And we're going to talk with young Latino leaders and the rest of us about what do you do with a broken immigration system, the moral cost, the human cost, what can be done, and more. So check out our website. I want to thank my colleagues, Kim Daniels, Kim Mazik, Anna Gordon, and Christian Sonnen. I've never say their last names, so I can't pronounce them. They did all the work to put this together, and my thanks to our colleagues at Berkeley, Tom, who welcomed us, but also Amy Vandervit, Imogene Johnson, and Michael Kessler, and others who helped put this together. It will not surprise you that these books are available back there. I think the authors, if you purchase one, might even sign it. So my advice is go to the bar, then get the book, and you'll have a great time. Finally, I want you to join me in thanking Tony Arnett, Joan Rosenauer, Zane, and Cardinal. And I ask you specifically, Cardinal Czerny, to please, on this anniversary, communicate to our Holy Father our enormous gratitude for his leadership, for his service, for his example, and assure him of our prayers. That first night, he looked out over the square and he said, "Pray for me." And please tell the Holy Father we are still praying for him. Join me in thanking these wonderful people.